I'm at the tail end of a very, very rich day, and as I've been listening to all the talks, I thought, oh, can I skip mine? I'm going to talk about a poet, but I will not be anywhere near the way Natalie spoke about poetry. But I'm very happy to have an opportunity just to speak with you. I'm conscious that a century ago, there are quite a number of English novelists and poets who wrote about what they identified as a decline in the quality of their own experience of English culture. And in particular, they were conscious of that in terms of the decline of the influence of Christianity at a spiritual and moral level in the society. So I'm thinking of people like Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, Aldous Huxley, W.H. Auden and T.S. Eliot, and of course there were a number of others as well, Hilaire Belloc and so on. I'd just like to focus on one poet, the thought of T.S. Eliot. Particularly I want to reflect upon what was not actually in his poetry, but rather in a talk that he gave on what he recognised as the effects of the decline of the influence of Christianity in his society. Of course, these poets, these great poets and novelists, wrote in the interwar period, which is now nearly a century ago. But I think their insights, what they saw happening at their time, are very opposite to our own. That's why I thought it would be interesting just to see, in one sense, they're kind of predicting some of the things that we are now conscious of experiencing, as we've spoken about today. So I want to speak about T.S. Eliot. Firstly, as the poet. You may be aware of one of his great poems, The Wasteland. It was written in 1922. Of course, he began writing it when he was about 18 years old. Really, it's a very disturbing, yet a monumental poem. And it's about social and psychological collapse. Of course, it came after the immense and futile tragedy of the First World War. And then, of course, we shouldn't forget the influence of the global influenza pandemic in 1918. But it's about a Europe that's on a path of self-destruction. It's almost like a eulogy for a dead culture. Because he wrote it also during a very difficult time in his own life. He was in an unhappy marriage, and he was caught up in a time of real personal anguish. So the poem reflects both the disillusion fostered by the sufferings and futility of war, and I think also his own personal struggles. In his earlier poem of 1915, the love song of J. for Prufrock, it's a sad and impotent monologue. And we see there Eliot exploring the sense of alienation, of isolation, of confusion, which really is a sort of a figure of what he saw as modern man. Again, his own personal struggles paralleled the angst in the culture. Similarly, in his 1925 poem, The Hollow Men, there's a picture of despair and spiritual aridity, where, again, I think Eliot is reflecting a society of his day which he somehow seems as to have lost a sense of meaning and purpose. The opening words, "We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men leaning together, headpiece filled with straw, alas. Our dried voices when we whisper together are quiet and meaningless, as wind in dry grass, or rats' feet over broken glass in our dry cellar." You might recall the end of the poem, which I hear still floats around culture one way or another, contemporary culture, where it says, the poem ends with, "This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but with a bang." Yeah, it still lives, doesn't it? Those words still live. So these three poems were a bit of a breakthrough in one sense in terms of poetic style, and they're commonly called modernist poetry. And they gained Eliot a reputation as being one of the finest poets of his generation. But they were written prior to the time when he actually embraced Christianity, when he became an Anglo-Catholic. In 1927, he converted from the Unitarianism of his family background in St. Louis, Missouri, to Christianity. And he embraced the Christian faith with such seriousness that for 25 years he was a church warden at St. Stephen's in Gloucester Road. In 1928, the following year, in a preface to an essay entitled For Lancelot Andrews, he described himself as a classicist in literature, a royalist in politics, and an Anglo-Catholic in religion. But of course, his conversion to Christianity changed very significantly the tone of his poetry. Now, his poetry was permeated by a new vision of life. So his first work after his conversion was that wonderful poem, The Journey of the Magi. A hard time he had of it, just the worst time of year. Wonderful poem. In 1928, he also wrote a song for Simeon. In 1935, he wrote that masterly verse drum which I love so much, The Murder in the Cathedral. And the play, of course, describes the assassination of the Archbishop Thomas of Becket in Canterbury Cathedral during the reign of Henry II in 1170. His masterpiece became a set of 4 poems which were originally published independently but were gathered and finally published together as 4 quartets in 1943. His intellectual integrity expressed in his poetry, as well as his general poetic mastery, earned him the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948. It's very obvious when you think of the pre-conversion poetry and the post-conversion poetry, a remarkable change in the vision of human life, vision of society, and in how he now saw what human life and society was meant to be. Eliot spent a lot of his time actually as a literary critic. I think he produced some 100 works of literary criticism. And he's also had the occasion to give public lectures. I'm actually not going to talk now about his poetry, but rather about one particular public lecture. In 1939, he actually gave a series of lectures at Cambridge University under the title of The Idea of a Christian Society. Later, these lectures were published as an extended essay, and along with another essay under the title of Notes Towards the Definition of Culture, and were published in a book produced in 1960 with the title Christianity and Culture. Eliot, of course, writing back in 1939, was very conscious of a number of factors. The first thing, of course, was the coming of the war, the rise of Nazism in Germany, and of course, at this stage too, Russian communism was becoming more and more evident in its evil character. So he saw and was very conscious of the rise of totalitarian regimes of Nazism and communism when he was writing. And no doubt these historical realities around him were influencing his thought. However, the book is not principally a critique of political issues. It is really an intellectual exercise. It's a reflection on what kind of society would be really in the best interests of its citizens. He's of course aware that English society that he lived in, he was originally of course an American and chose to be naturalised as an Englishman. But he understands that while he says a society has ceased to be Christian, when its religious practices have been abandoned, it has also ceased, he says, when the behaviour ceases to be regulated by reference to Christian principle. And when in effect, prosperity in this world for the individual or for the group has become the sole conscious aim. In these words, he identifies a shift that was occurring in culture in England. And he understood that without a Christian vision of life, a focus on the personal pursuit of wealth and pleasure readily becomes the cultural focus. Eliot is aware that the culture of his time remains Christian, really now only in some vestigial form. The culture of England was being reshaped by, at that stage, we talked about today, by the ideology of liberalism, which was in effect, of course, secular and not religious. He gave some very, I think, insightful comments on the effects of this particular, if you like, secular liberalism of his day. Now, this is almost 100 years ago, but I think we can hear echoes of our own culture. He says, liberalism tends to release energy rather than accumulate it, to relax rather than to fortify. It is a movement not so much defined by its end as by its starting point, away from rather than towards something definite. Our point of departure is more real to us than our destination. And the destination is likely to present a very different picture when arrived at from the vaguer image formed in the imagination. By destroying traditional social habits of the people, by dissolving their natural collective consciousness into individual constituents, by licensing the opinions of the most foolish, by substituting instruction for education, by encouraging cleverness rather than wisdom, the upstart rather than the qualified, by fostering a notion of getting on to which the alternative is a hopeless apathy. Liberalism can prepare the way for that which is its own negative. The artificial, mechanised, or brutalised control, which is a desperate remedy for its chaos. So he sees that such an ideology seeks to liberate individuals from what it considers to be the constraints of tradition and social morality. It promotes a false freedom. He's only too aware of where it can lead. And here he sees evidence of this in the totalitarianism of both Nazism and communism. In truth, societies become pagan and become subject to forms of, as he says, mechanised and brutalised control. So he saw that inevitably any benign attitude of liberalism towards Christianity would inevitably harden into opposition. So back in 1939, he commented, "The problem of leading a Christian life in a non-Christian society is now very present to us. And it is a very different problem from that of the accommodation between the established church and the dissenters. It's not merely the problem of a minority in a society of individuals holding an alien belief. It's the problem constituted by our implication in a network of institutions from which we cannot dissociate ourselves. Institutions, the operation of which appears no longer neutral but non-Christian. And as for the Christian who is not conscious of his dilemma, and he is in the majority, he is becoming more and more de-Christianised by all sorts of unconscious pressure. Paganism, he says, holds all the most valuable advertising space. So what Eliot recognised 100 years ago, I think is now what we are experiencing in our society. Such social movements are not so much immediately anti-Christian, though, as he says, they will become so. Rather, they slowly erode the spirituality and morality of believers, often without them realising it. Thus, today we have many who still claim to be Christian, but have no real living faith, and have lost sight of a Christian understanding, for instance, of the nature of the human person. In fact, they view the traditional Christian teaching as out of touch and actually repressive, while all the time thinking that they are still Christian. They see themselves as moving with the times and quickly view orthodox Christian teaching as no longer relevant and opposed to the advancement of society. Eliot is concerned about where this will all lead. And he says, without Christianity, we might, of course, merely sink into an apathetic decline. Without faith, and therefore without faith in ourselves, without a philosophy of life, either Christian or pagan, and without art. Or we might get a totalitarian democracy, different but having much in common with other pagan societies, because we shall have changed step by step in order to keep pace with them. A state of affairs in which we shall have regimentation and conformity, without respect for the needs of the individual soul. The Puritanism of a hygienic morality in the interest of efficiency. Uniformity of opinion through propaganda, and art only encouraged when it flatters the official doctrines of the time. I don't know if you hear any echoes of what's happening today. Look, he does paint a rather grim picture. Again, this, and I hate to finish the day with this grim picture, but he does paint this rather grim picture of what society can become. It is a culture which aims to enjoy the fruits of material success without being prepared to advance the good of the culture. It is a culture that fosters a pursuit of leisure as a mere satisfaction of appetites. It avoids social constraints and does not see the worth of striving for virtue. Indeed, if a person seeks to uphold or even argue for more elevated standards, they are quickly punished for going against the prejudices of the day. People live for themselves and not for the positive advancement of the good. So Eliot realises there must be another way. He understands a way of a disciplined way of life, a way of life that is required of a religious, or more specifically Christian faith. So he says, to those who can imagine and are therefore repelled by such a prospect, one can assert that the only possibility of control and balance is a religious control and balance. That the only hopeful course for a society which would thrive and continue its creative activity in the arts of civilization is to become Christian. That prospect involves at least discipline, inconvenience and discomfort. But here, as hereafter, the alternative to hell is purgatory. Eliot considers the question of what a society shaped by Christianity would look like. He is aware that he cannot hope for the bulk of the citizens now to embrace Christianity. However, he does propose that a society can be sufficiently grounded in Christianity that it should be able to enable a Christian framework in which political decision-making is carried out. So he's not proposing that Christianity be a state religion, but that those in leadership recognise the need for higher values. He explains it thus. What the rulers believed would be less important than the beliefs to which they would be obliged to conform. And a sceptical or indifferent statesman working within a Christian frame might be more effective than a devout Christian statesman obliged to conform to a secular frame. For he would be required to design his policy for the government of a Christian society. So he does see some hope that when those in leadership are those who do see the greater good and are driven by moral ideals, he does understand that the capitalist system, which now drives our society, is not conducive to the promotion of these higher values. And the focus on financial success and the concomitant desire for comfort and pleasure make the pursuit of personal virtue very difficult. A society truly grounded in a Christian vision of life would be, as he says, a society in which the natural end of man, virtue, and the well-being of community is acknowledged by all, and the supernatural end, beatitude, for those who have the eyes to see it. Eliot knows that few in society would see things this way. At the present time, our Australian society now views the social contract as a balancing of rights and needs among atomised individuals. We've lost sight of the common communal vision of striving for the common good, and therefore we are in a dangerous situation. Eliot states we have to find another way. Unless we can find, he says, a pattern into which all the problems of life can have their place, we're only likely to go on complicating chaos. So long, for instance, as we consider finance, industry, trade, agriculture, merely as competing interests to be reconciled from time to time as best they may, so long as we consider education as a good in itself, of which everyone has a right to the utmost. Without any ideal of the good life for society or for the individual, we shall move from one uneasy compromise to another. So he's calling for a fundamental rethinking of our cultural assumptions. The soulless pursuit of individual goals will only lead to cultural decline. The need is rather for people to integrate their lives in such a way that they are oriented towards the common good and hopefully a transcendental vision of life and life hereafter. And such progress needs a religious foundation. In line with Christopher Dawson, Eliot realises that religion is essential for cultural health and well-being. As he says, no culture has appeared or developed except together with a religion. According to the point of view of the observer, the culture will appear to be the product of the religion, or the religion the product of the culture. As he looks out back in 1939 on the way that the culture of England is unfolding, he does make a rather glum assessment of the future. He says, if Christianity goes, the whole of our culture goes. You must then start painfully again. And you cannot put on a new culture ready-made. You must wait for the grass to grow, to feed the sheep, to give the wool out of which your new coat will be made. You must pass through many centuries of barbarism. You should not live to see the new culture, nor would our great-great-great-grandchildren. And if we did, not one of us would be happy with it. He does, however, identify a couple of key elements to the preservation of the Christian influence in the society. And one is, not surprising to people here, education. He sees that there is a need for educational institutes to be based in a Christian vision of life. These schools would provide the students with an understanding of the need for the pursuit of virtue. And thus the current interest in schools that offer education based in the liberal arts is something I'm sure T.S. Eliot would greatly approve. The second element that he considers important is that there be some places where a rigorous Christian critique of society is able to be articulated. There needs to be what we're doing here today, what Christopher Dawson Centre stands for. A Christian thinker will see society with a different set of eyes from those immersed in advancing a godless agenda centred on the advancement of the self. In other words, we need places where the Christian vision for human life can be articulated and the culture of the day scrutinised from a Christian perspective. May I end with a little word of hope. So look, despite many claims to the contrary, Christianity is not done yet. It has always had an amazing capacity for spiritual and moral resurgence. And this must be and always remain our hope and our goal as we strive towards our future in our Australian society. Thank you.